Okay, I'd love for us to get started. Again, hello and welcome to How Investors Can End Forced Arbitration for Sexual Harassment. We'll be together for about an hour. My co-leads, Iris Quo and Shannon Coulter, and I are going to be giving you an update on Force the Issue, how you can use the database, our story and strategy, and then we're going to open it up in the last 20 minutes or so for Q&A and collaboration, because it's mostly a group of actually very influential investors here. And we know that we aren't the only ones who have something to say about how this data can be used. So I just want to start by welcoming everyone. I want to welcome all parts of you. As investors, we tend to come with our heads and forget if we aren't focusing on it directly or in a meditation. We tend to forget that sometimes we're whole human beings. So we actually are coming with our bellies, which are kind of like the center of our bodies, and also our hearts. And I want to ask you to stay in your heart for a moment as we acknowledge the recent mass shootings. We want to recognize and remember all of those that we lost in Boulder, Colorado, and in Atlanta, Georgia in the last 2 weeks. And I want to take a moment, actually, all of us in co-leadership at Force the Issue really felt that it was important to take a moment to acknowledge that our shared enemy here is misogyny, white supremacy, and racism. This was this work that we're doing, where forced arbitration is concerned, particularly as it pertains to the situation in Atlanta, is part of work against gender-based violence and racialized violence. And those are things that we know escalate over time. Sexual harassment's on a continuum of gender-based violence and dehumanization. And in our work to end forced arbitration for sexual harassment, we have seen time and time again that objectification and dehumanization come up in instances of sexual harassment. And in particular, with the shootings in Atlanta of the Asian American women there, we know that there was that intersection of race, class, and sex all coming together. And we find that in our work with ending forced arbitration for sexual harassment, that there's a very similar intersection happening. So after having welcomed you to bring your whole self to this conversation about how we can enforce arbitration for sexual harassment, I want to introduce my co-leads. So if we can go to the next slide. You'll be hearing today from me. I'm Rachel Robichotti, the founder and CEO of Adasina Social Capital. You'll be hearing from Iris Quo, who is the founder of Ledbetter, and from Shannon Coulter, who is the executive director of the Grab Your Wallet Alliance. And I'd like to pass it to you, Shannon, just to ground us in the definition of forced arbitration for sexual harassment. What is that? Oh, and I really love our animation on the slides. That is so fun.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shannon, as Rachel said. I'm going to quickly take you through what we mean when we say forced arbitration for sexual harassment. And the first thing I want to emphasize is that there's really no one way that this happens at corporations. Arbitration agreements really vary from company to company, and there are a number of different ways that they can manifest. But we do see some common themes with how they're typically used. So I'm just going to take you through that. First of all, they're used by employers to require workers as a condition of employment, typically, to give up their right to access the courts in order to resolve sexual harassment claims and other kinds of disputes. We have seen some cases where these are implemented not as a condition of employment, but after the fact, so after the harassment has already taken place. But typically the way it plays out is that, in your new bundle of paperwork, when you become an employee at a company, there will typically be a forced arbitration agreement in there somewhere that asks you to give up your right to sue the company should you ever experience harassment and usually discrimination. So if you think of it this way, it means that when you walk into the building as a new employee, you have your basic right as a citizen to sue the company and have your day in court. And then when you sign that piece of paper, you no longer have that right. So it removes a basic right of being a US citizen. A lot of what we know about forced arbitration, we know from the Economic Policy Institute and specifically Alexander J. Coven there. We know since the early 2000s, for instance, that the practice is very much on the rise and that the share of workers in the US who are subject to these agreements has more than doubled. Among companies with more than 1,000 workers, it's particularly egregious. So 65% of workers in that category are subject to forced arbitration agreements. So that's an estimated 60 million workers in the US. We know from the EPI as well that the practice is very much unfairly applied. A couple of years ago, they found that women and Black workers are more commonly subject to mandatory arbitration than other workers. So when you consider other recent studies that have found, for instance, that Black women are also subject to higher rates of harassment in general, and that those rates of harassment actually climb during economic downturns like the one we've been experiencing recently, you really start to see the systemic harm that's being done here. The last thing I'll say about what it is as a definition is that forced arbitration, we know from EPI's research as well, favors employers and silences victims. So arbitration research has shown that the proceedings very much favor employers, most likely because those employers benefit from maintaining close paid relationships with the arbiters who are deciding the cases. These agreements often include what I like to call an NDA turned up to 11, which means that the worker who is initiating the arbitration proceeding is prevented from refraining those proceedings typically, even with close family members and friends. So again, favors employers, silences victims. And I'm going to turn it over to Rachel.
Wonderful. So I get to tell you a bit about the impact that we've had with Force the Issue so far, and also just what our basic business case is. And this is something we're really hoping that investors are able to take with them heading into engagements with publicly traded companies. So starting with the impact, next slide, please. Right now, I'm very proud to announce that our website at forcetheissue.org now has over 3,500 companies listed with their status on this critical issue, where they stand on forcing their employees into arbitration for sexual harassment. That number represents all of the most commonly traded public companies in the United States where this is primarily an issue. When we started, we had 5 companies that were on the record as having ended this practice, and we are now at a place where we have over 350 companies that are confirmed to not practice forced arbitration and are on the record as doing so. And that means that over 10 million employees now know that they can take their harasser, or in some cases their abuser, to court. So when we talk about impact investing, and we really look to expand the impact well beyond any one particular portfolio, and we look at really systems and the systems that underpin certain types of oppression, this is the kind of impact that we're looking for, this large systemic impact beyond any one portfolio. If we can go to the next slide. I want to let you know that I'm going to go over with you like 3 different costs and 3 different benefits of either continuing the practice or ending the practice. And this is all summarized in the investor statement for ending forced arbitration for sexual harassment that's available on our website, and we'll give you the link to that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, for public companies, and actually for all companies, there are some pretty big arguments for ending the practice, most of which is that it's very costly to continue with the status quo. So forced arbitration is something that actually prevents the public from, and including investors, from having access to a company's history of how they've managed sexual harassment. And what that means is that we are unable then to assess whether a company provides a safe, respectful, inclusive workplace, that particular type of environment for their employees, which is now a well-known indicator of profitability and shareholder returns. We also know that having forced arbitration in place creates a culture of acceptance. but that's very costly. The typical Fortune 500 company loses over $14 million per year. $14 million per year on average per company because of absenteeism, low productivity, staff turnover directly as a result of sexual harassment. And so sometimes you're talking to these public companies, and while arbitration may save the employer on legal bills, that's usually their kind of response, like, why would we open ourselves up to court? The reality is that having a culture that enables serial sexual harassment makes it actually harder for everyone in the company to get work done. And that, not legal bills, is actually what costs employers the most in the long run. And then the last point that I want to make here about why this practice is so costly is that it really exacerbates pre-existing racial, gender, and economic injustice that's already present. What we know, as Shannon said, is that a study found that women, African American, and low-wage workers specifically, so again, we find this issue of women, so issues of sex, African American workers, issues of race, and low-wage workers, issues of class, are coming together to show us that these are the folks who are most often subjected to forced arbitration. And that suggests that forced arbitration is disproportionately negatively impacting these already vulnerable communities. And if we want our businesses to create more of what we want in the world, that is certainly not racial, gender, and economic injustice. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we get to the fun stuff. And the fun stuff is all about, like, well, you know, if you're engaging with a company and you've told them about all the costs, now you can actually tell them about some of the big benefits. The first is about inspiring brand loyalty. Ending this practice really has the particularly when companies are public about it, has this possibility of inspiring brand loyalty from a generation of these socially savvy, values motivated consumers. After our racial justice uprisings last year, over 60% of consumers said that they would potentially boycott a company based on racial justice issues alone. So we are in a whole new world when it comes to consumers exercising brand loyalty, and ending this practice is something that shows that you are aware of these issues of gender, racial, and economic justice. This also offers a competitive edge in hiring. This is something that tech companies are already starting to get the memo on, which is why they were, I believe, the first five, that first handful of companies. And we know that any company's success is dependent upon its ongoing ability to attract top talent. And most sexual harassment claims are brought by women. So ending this practice, particularly in very competitive environments where we're looking for more diversity, equity, and inclusion, is a clear signal that companies have taken proactive steps to create a safe, inclusive, and more diverse environment. And the last piece, and this is my favorite, and this is one of the reasons that it's been such a rewarding campaign to work on, is how easily it is for even the largest of companies to end the practice. So in the recent years, as you can see now, hundreds of publicly traded companies have very swiftly ended this practice. And so the fact that it's so easily done, is so costly to continue, and yet has tremendous benefits for ending the practice, really puts us in a place where I find making this argument to be very straightforward to public companies. And I believe it's one of the reasons we've been so successful. If you go to the next slide, here's that web address for you. We'll put it in the chat as well. This is an investor statement that you can take with you in your company engagements. It was signed by over $54 billion in assets. And it makes all of these points very cogently. I would like to now turn it over to Iris, who can tell you all more about the story and the strategy involved with Force the Issue. Again, I am just loving that animation. Go, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Iris Kuo, and I ran a company called Ledbetter that published data on workplace equity. And we co-led Force the Issue, and I'll take you through some of the background and strategy for how we stood up this campaign. Thank you. So it was around late 2018 when Rachel brought in myself and Shannon to co-lead this work. And at the time, it was against the continuing backdrop of the Me Too movement Interest was very high to address sexual harassment and gender equity in the workplace. And according to worker advocates who we were in conversation with, workplace sexual harassment was a significant concern for women's workplace equity in particular. And at the same time, companies like Microsoft and Google were already voluntarily dropping the policy. So there seemed to be an opening to eliminate forced arbitration for sexual harassment at more companies. So Rachel came up with the idea and brought Shannon and I in. And this campaign in particular was different from other data-driven campaigns that Shannon and I had separately worked on in the past, in that it would be backed by an investor letter, which Rachel already told you a little bit about. And the hypothesis, which was correct, was that this investor letter would add heft and pressure to the call for companies to release this information on whether or not they have this harmful practice. So we came up with a plan to create a database that would be public on a website, an investor letter, and I also proposed a color-coded system with red, yellow, green to make clear who still had this practice, who was in murky territory, and who had definitively ended forced arbitration for sexual harassment. Next slide, please. So this was our shared theory of change. And as an aside, I've spent most of my career as a journalist for outlets like the Wall Street Journal, and it was always my job as a reporter to hold government and business leaders, excuse me, accountable for their words and their actions. So the thesis for Force the Issue, as well as for Ledbetter and Grab Your Wallet's work, is here. It's that data collected in coordination with movements and workers, paired with corporate transparency on their workplace conditions, results in accountability for corporations on workplace equity. And I'll give you some examples of how we validated this theory of change prior to Force the Issue's kickoff. Next slide. Thank you. So both Grab Your Wallet and Ledbetter's teams have seen firsthand how data can spark corporate action. On the left, in Shannon's case at Grab Your Wallet, a simple Google spreadsheet that documented which companies carried Trump products in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape, which, if you remember, in 2016 showed Trump making lewd comments about women's bodies. This spreadsheet and Shannon and her team's incredible advocacy eventually led to retailers like Neiman Marcus and Nordstrom dropping Trump products from their shelves. And as you can see, Shannon has been featured in the New York Times as well as numerous other publications. And on the right, Ledbetter also started with a Google spreadsheet that we eventually turned into a website that listed major consumer brands and how their level of gender parity in leadership and on their board. And when we released our findings, it included the discovery of a makeup company called Coty, which sells products like Sally Hansen nail polish, Rimmel makeup, lipsticks, eyeliners, all products that are largely marketed to women. And they, in fact, had 0 women on their board and 0 women on their executive team. There was widespread media coverage of our findings in outlets like CNN, Fortune, CBS, and others. And Coty later said that they would add women to both their board and their leadership, and they have done so. And so this is really the power that data and making data public has to create change. Next slide, please. So this is the phased strategic plan that we came up with for Force the Issue. The first stage was to put companies on notice. This is with the investor statement and launching with a few hundred companies in our database in September of 2019. The next step was to turn up the heat. We added more companies to the website. Grab Your Wallet did deep corporate engagement. We published a Business Roundtable report covering which companies in the Business Roundtable still had this harmful practice in place. And we continued to get media coverage from outlets like the Washington Post, Quartz, and others. And the current phase we're in is we're adding everyone to the hot seat with this full database available of publicly traded companies, 3,500 plus publicly traded companies. And what we are working towards next is wide scale change through getting more corporations to voluntarily drop this practice. There are also some bills making their way through legislative houses that could make it mandatory to drop this practice. And we also hope to engage more workers in the process of advocating for them. If you move to the next slide. the strategic questions we have, that's one of the strategic questions we have for the next phase, which is how do we work more closely in conversation with the workers that we are advocating for, as well as movement coordination. How do we ensure the work is done in coordination with movement leaders in movements like worker justice, economic justice, gender justice, and racial justice? And finally, we are in the process of incubating new ideas. These include creating combined stakeholder pressure for companies to release racial equity data. Rachel mentioned the racial justice uprisings of last year. The pressure is ratcheting up on companies to release this information, and we are thinking about ways we can contribute to that pressure, as well as ensuring that worker voices are represented in decision-making and cultural narrative. So that's our strategic overview, and I will now pass it to Shannon for project insights.
Hi again. So as Iris mentioned, I led the deep corporate engagement side of this project. And I'll just say in general that as a strategy, I tend to keep my communications really structured with companies and professional in tone. I've been on the corporate side of the equation in these interactions. So I tend to go in believing and knowing that a lot of people on Marcom teams are actually my secret allies, and that if it were up to them, a lot of these companies would abandon the practice that we're asking them to abandon. So I went in, believing that. It's of course not always true, but it's often true. And I think that this particular strategy had a lot of positive impact. If you could go to the next slide. So we're just going to talk about some of the insights we've gained to date. This is definitely a long game that we're playing, and big publicly traded companies are, big boats that turn very slowly. So I would say one of the overarching insights we've had is that we need to be patient as we make this change. But we are seeing, what I would describe as a significant amount of positive traction on the change that we're seeking. The pandemic definitely slowed things down a bit, but sexual harassment is very much back in the news. So we're seeing an uptick in activity from corporations. I have 3 emails sitting in my inbox right now from companies saying that they've dropped the practice. So the number has risen even while we've been speaking. And also the FAIR Act, which Iris also mentioned, the bill that's making its way through Congress is having an impact. It just recently went to the Senate Judiciary Committee. So I think that's turning up the heat as well. And I, of course, am reminding my compatriots in the corporate world, all of this is happening. I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology because I know that investors really care about that. So this is as technical as I'm going to get in my comments. Before publishing a company's profile page, every company has a profile page on the forcetheissue.org site that shows the status of whether or not they use forced arbitration for sexual harassment. So when I reach out to companies, I'm asking them first, do you use this practice? And giving them a chance to let me know before that page ever goes live. I do let them know in that piece of communication that if I don't hear back from them, that the company will be listed as probably requiring arbitration for sexual harassment. And that's because we have research in hand that shows us that that is the case, right? We know that big publicly traded companies use this practice at a high rate. So we're saying, we think you probably use this practice. And of course, this language and this approach was vetted with relevant attorneys. And so we're reaching out, we're saying, do you use this practice? We're giving them a chance to respond. If they don't respond, or if they do, we publish the page. And then over time, I'm going back to these companies and asking them again, do you have any updates? I'm using various things in the news cycle to as a prompt for those communications. For instance, the FAIR Act making its way to the Senate, this just happened. Do you have any updates? Or, hey, your competitor just let me know that they've dropped the practice. Do you have any updates? Our experience is that corporations tend to pay attention to their competitors' moves even more than they pay attention to the moves of social justice advocates. So we definitely use that as a strategy in getting them to consider making this change. And we're also, like I said, I know a lot of people on Marcom teams are actually looking for reasons to take this to their bosses and say, hey, this is back, in my inbox. This just happened. Can we talk about this again? So we're giving them reasons to take this information to their executive teams and their boards and say, can we consider making this change? That is really the data gathering as engagement piece. So we're treating this as relationship building. We are forming relationships with these IR and PR representatives over time. And in many cases, we've seen companies, make changes, and many is an overstatement. So in a handful of cases, we know for a fact that our campaign was directly responsible for a company making the change, and they've actually told us, our policy has changed since you last reached out. In many cases, the methodology, the overarching strategy is that we don't make them say that. We actually, if you look closely at that screen on the left, you can see that the green companies are listed as definitely have ended or never used the practice. And that wording was very deliberate, and Rachel and Iris and I worked hard to craft that language and strategy, because we knew that if we asked companies to tell us that we were the reason they were making the change, most of them wouldn't do that. But if we gave them kind of a little bit of cover and said, hey, you don't have to tell us when or why you ended the practice, only that you don't use it. So that's why the language is the way that it is. I will say too, on the last point, that policymakers in DC are definitely paying attention to this campaign and to the data. I can't really go into more detail than that, but I'll just say that at the highest levels, we've had requests for this data, and that we're seeing it, shape the thinking around these policies and practices. And I'm turning it back over to Rachel, I believe.
Hi, everybody. I'll go right to the next slide. Just want to take you through next steps. How investors can actually use the database is pretty straightforward. You can actually use it to impact how you invest. You can actually use it as you are engaging with public companies. We've already had lots of feedback from investors that they're leveraging the data in that way. And you can also just use it yourself, and it's something that you can talk about with clients and colleagues. So whether as an investor or a consumer, making informed choices about where you put your money. On the investing side, I know that there are quite a few folks here who use the Adasina public equity strategy primarily as the exchange traded fund that we have. The ticker symbol is JSTC. And if you are using that public equity strategy, it's a core strategy. We've already long since integrated this data into that ETF, along with all of the different campaigns that we work on. This data is also available for investor download on the Force the Issue website. And we tried to do it at cost. So it's the cost for maintaining the data over time. So for $7.99 per year, we have the possibility of downloading the entire spreadsheet with GICS codes and ISINs. And if you're a big data nerd in the investment space, you know why those are valuable. If you're not, never mind. But that data is actually free and publicly available without all of that additional data, just directly at forcetheissue.org. One of the things that we'll want to move into, if we go to the next slide, is we move into the Q&A for this. And actually, it's a community conversation. It's time for collaboration. And we've been gathering up the questions that you've been putting in the chat. One of our questions to you is are there folks who are already using it, who are already using the database? We'd love to hear from you about how you're using it. And of course, we'll start asking some of the questions that have come up in the chat. So I know on our end, technically, we need to give folks the option of unmuting so that they can kind of speak up directly. Let's see. Now everyone can unmute themselves if they'd like. And we're a big group, but I trust that we'll all handle a conversation. Well, maybe I know we need to go through the last few slides to Elizabeth, who is our lovely human being that's going through the slideshow. But now we can actually see each other. So if you're comfortable with it, also going on video would be great. I want to see if there's anybody who already uses the data and has something to contribute right now about how you're using it, what your experience has been. So I want to leave some space for that. And also know that we're gathering up the questions you've already put in the chat, and we're open to you asking questions directly. Going to be quiet for a moment and see if anybody wants to unmute themselves. Okay, no one just yet. I always believe in these instances that it's really important to leave space for folks to speak up. So also, if you're more comfortable putting questions in the chat, that's totally fine. Tia, who is from Criterion Institute, one of our collaborators, had written, is there research on the benefits of the practice for companies, how much they save via lawsuits, et cetera, by having forced arbitration clauses? And then Denise wrote back, I have some info on this, happy to share with you. Companies like arbitration because generally they appoint the arbiter who is then more likely to side with the company. This is so true. And arbitration resolutions tend to pay less in remuneration than going through the courts. Denise, is that something that is the data that you may have, something that you're able to share with the larger group here?
Yes, hi, Rachel, and I'm sorry I'm not on video. I'm just on the move.
No worries.
Yeah, I'm happy to dig it up. And what's the easiest way of sharing it? Should I share it with you and you can share it more broadly? Okay.
Absolutely. We'll send it to everyone that's actually on the call with us today.
Okay.
That would be perfect. Great. And then there's another question, and Iris and Shannon, we can directly decide like who wants to answer this ourselves. But like, what are the main reasons behind deciding to focus on forced arbitration versus other potential avenues? For example, NDAs, general gender-based violence, and harassment policies. Danielle, thank you for that question. And
I would
yeah, go
say
ahead.
that I consider forced arbitration agreements to be NDAs. They generally contain NDAs, and so they're sort of like a supercharged NDA in some ways. And then in terms of like strategizing about why we tackled this particular issue versus some others, one thing that really appealed to me about this project when Rachel brought it to me was that she was telling me, look, we've already talked to impacted communities, and we are hearing that this is the issue they would like addressed most specifically and directly. So having that kind of, feedback and direct inline and, insight into how impacted communities saw this issue was really valuable to me and made me feel really motivated.
Yeah, and truly, just to be clear, we understand that forced arbitration is a problem for all protected classes. So whether you're bringing up directly issues of racism, sexism, et cetera, this was a very specific thing that we could do. And when we started, we had very limited resources for doing it. This was a very specific thing that we could do that would address an intersectional issue. So this was the issue where we saw that overlap of race, gender, economic justice showing up given who's impacted. And honestly, it is, if you're taking a stair step kind of strategic approach, it's easier for a company to say, sure, we'll carve that one out. And it's much harder to get them to end the forced arbitration full stop. But so it is a bit of an incrementalist approach, but it's an incrementalist approach that very directly lifts up the voices and needs of those who are most impacted and most vulnerable in the workplace. Shannon, I want to have you speak to this other issue that came up in the chat from Jen, which is, how do you think multiple efforts now, like paid leave, Pregnant Workers Protection Act, and the FAIR Act, help to connect efforts to engage corporations on public policy? Did I get that right?
Such an excellent question and really on my mind lately. As usual, Jen has amazing insight into the interplay between these two worlds. As you know, toward the end of the most recent round of activity on Force the Issue, we as a group have really started to think about the ways in which this work might impact some of the policy stuff happening on the Hill. We know that the FAIR Act is at a really crucial juncture. We know already in this administration that center right and center left Dems are going to play an especially pivotal role in making sure that equity related legislation passes, and that we can't take that passage for granted. So most recently, we started to think about, how what are the companies that we should be paying attention to and putting maybe even a little bit more additional positive pressure on to act as thought leaders in this area. And the way that we did that was my organization, which is a 501c4 and is permitted to therefore be a little bit more political in its activities, looked at which big publicly traded companies are headquartered in these key senators' states, and how much do they donate to these senators. And Anna Civic from Grab Your Wallet, who's on this call, was really pivotal in putting that data together and the insights around it. And so we kind of identified a short list of companies that we think should be showing a special level of thought leadership on this stuff. And we're going to possibly be reaching out to them to talk about how that happens. And I'm happy to share that report with anybody who'd like it.
Wonderful. Yes,
And
Maria.
Specifically to Jen's question too, I want to say there are a lot of different equity related pieces of legislation happening right now. We think they all matter, and that corporations can act as engines of influence on these pieces of legislation in really key ways. So the priorities are hard to determine sometimes. They're all important. They all impact a lot of workers. We are actively looking for insights from other key stakeholders on what their priorities are with respect to this legislation versus forced arbitration. So anybody who has those insights or that feedback, I'm happy to hear them at any point.
Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, we have been pleasantly surprised at how useful this information has been on a policy front. And Mariana, I'm so excited to see you here. Would love to hear from you. Yes, I saw your hand.
And hey, Denise, it's nice to see you in this group as well.
Hi, I know, same here.
So I have two questions. One is for Shannon. I love what you're doing, and I know that you were quite cautious in sort of talking about the legislative strategy. Perhaps you'd be sort of comfortable saying what your sort of predictions are for success, given sort of the composition of the Senate, and the fact that there are a number of moderate senators from states where a number of companies are based or incorporated. As to kind of the likelihood of success, it's something I'm thinking about quite a bit right now on a number of other issues. And secondly, for the first time in maybe like 12 years, I'm not an insider and don't have access to insider information, so I can trade my own securities. And so I've been looking at, this is for Rachel. I'm curious about your predictions for the performance of the ETF, and also whether you expect the net expense ratio will come down over the course of the sort of year or two as the ETF settles, because I'd love to put some cash into it, but I want to sort of get a sense of where it's going and whether it's going to cost a little bit less compared to the other socially impactful funds.
That's a very interesting question. So and we can maybe put in the chat the link to the website for folks who are interested in getting more information about the ETF. So in terms of what our expectations are, I have to be very thoughtful about how I respond, mostly because we're recording this and want to be able to put it back out and hope that our compliance department believes that we are fully complying with all of the regulations around speaking about a publicly traded security. Here's what I can tell you that is in the prospectus. We are operating under the assumption that social movements are giving us early indicators of risk in public markets. And you can just kind of see what's happened with sexual harassment as things come to light. Companies that had these policies in place can ultimately have huge reputational risk. And that's true for a number of different issues that we're focusing on. So while it is a core strategy and core strategies are genuinely tracking market-like returns, we are operating on a particular thesis, and we are gathering evidence to back that up over time. In terms of the expense ratio, it is 89 basis points or 89% of 1%. And we don't anticipate that expense ratio going down. The reason for that is because in addition to managing the portfolio, we have a full arm of social justice work. And so in paying that 89 basis points kind of expense ratio, part of what you are funding are the industry-wide campaigns that go well beyond just targeting our own portfolio for shareholder resolutions, for example, which is kind of what's most common. So it's really the cost of doing business. It's the cost of having this type of impact. And I think it's really up to each individual investor to check in with themselves about, is it worth it? It's 89% of 1%. Is that actually worth having real large-scale systemic impact in public markets? That's a good question. I have
Also, I want to address your question about the policy change. I think about that all the time. It's such a great question. I don't know is the answer. I personally am taking the strategy of not taking anything for granted. I think that you're right that those center left and center right Dems, or center left Dems and center right Republicans are going to be really pivotal, and that we have to use every tool in the tool belt to make sure that they do the right thing.
And the other thing that I would add, Marianne, is that other ESG funds aren't using this data yet. One of the reasons we're having this call is to actually invite other ESG firms into using this data. So when we talk about social justice movements giving us early indicators of risk, one of the benefits, part of what you're paying for, is the fact that by doing these campaigns, we do have early access to data like this as well. I see Brent has raised his hand. Brent, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment?
Yeah, it's a question. I'd love to. Thanks. So Shannon, you mentioned earlier that a handful of firms say that the forced issue campaign is the reason they did away with forced arbitration. And I'm just curious, the movements I'm involved with, I often try and track additionality, kind of like what would have happened if I weren't there, and what am I sort of along for the ride on versus what did I kind of actually influence that wouldn't have happened without me? Are you guys making any efforts in that kind of direction, or is there a way to measure that?
Not as yet. I will say that just to be super clear, and I apologize if I wasn't before, I wouldn't say it's accurate that we know that companies made the change because of our campaign. What we know is that they made the change after we reached out to them. Only in one case do we know more than that, which is the MGM Resorts was an unusual exchange between me and their IR person, and that's the company that the Washington Post piece most focused on, because that was the one where we had the most evidence that forced the issue probably played an active role. But it's, as you know, it sounds like you know already, it's really hard to prove that. And so we just, with the handful, we know that, like Dell just told us, for instance, that yes, we changed our policy from the last time that you reached out to us. So that's what we know. And we're not doing any analysis yet around eventuality. We do have a lot of data that we're sitting on that we need to analyze. And I'm excited about the possibility of turning it over to academics who will know what to do with it better than I do.
And we really gave up them crediting us for the possibility of making change. And that is actually pretty important. And I think that's often what's necessary when you're tracking large scale systemic change, is giving up the credit piece and just saying, you know what, this is the work that we're doing. And as long as the shift is made, that's what matters most. And the companies really want a lot of cover. They don't want to feel pressured. They want to say that they did it themselves. Totally fine with me.
It's
definitely, as long as we're liberating workers, that's all I care about.
It's definitely a question we asked ourselves a lot in the beginning, like, how will we know we've succeeded? I think ideally the blue sky answer to that is if we saw companies drop the practice at a rate that exceeded the rate that we know that they use it, which is a pretty high rate. We're not even close to there yet, but in spite of that, having 350 plus, almost 400 actually as of this hour, companies on the record as not using the practice after, only a handful being on the record prior to that, feels like a big victory.
Absolutely. We have another question that is specifically for Iris, and it is, how did you decide upon the phases in the strategic plan slide?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So I think there were a couple of things that went into the strategic plan. One was that we were seeing that as I mentioned earlier, there were some companies voluntarily dropping the policy. The issue was in the media, and it seemed like a right moment to try to extract some wins. And part of it was that we wanted to have a crescendo, a slow build, to give us time to start the database, put companies on notice, gather momentum for the campaign, and yeah, take the time to crescendo. And it also took time for us to build out the database, and we didn't want to wait until the entire 3,500 companies was in the database to release it. We really wanted to start, and Shannon did some amazing strategic selection here around which companies we would start with, and she can probably tell you more about what went into the decision making around that. And as I mentioned earlier, what we're hoping for in the next phase is to really bring in worker engagement. We did want to kick off strong with the investor letter and the backing of investor dollars to help elicit the responses from the companies and build from there.
Wonderful. Elisa Batista is here from Ultraviolet. I tried to give Elisa a heads up that I was going to ask Elisa to speak. If any of you don't know Ultraviolet, I just want to give an opportunity. We're so happy to see you here. I just want to give an opportunity for folks to know what Ultraviolet does and how that intersects with this work specifically.
Yes, well, I was really excited to see you all host this meeting. So my name is Elisa Batista. I'm a campaign director with Ultraviolet. We're a gender justice organization. I go by she, her, and I lead on a lot of our survivor justice initiatives. And one of those campaigns did include pressuring investors at Comcast regarding widespread sexual abuse and cover up at NBC News. And we did, due to our campaigns, we were able to successfully pressure Chris Matthews and Matt Lauer off the air, Harvey Weinstein, among other really bad apples. So we're focused on both structural change as well as getting rid of the individual bad apples. And so this is why we're interested in the work that you all are doing, how we can further pressure investors and corporations to help us root out a culture of sexual violence.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and for letting us know about your work at Ultraviolet. And we're excited about deepening that relationship too. I would love to hear from any investors. What do you need from Force the Issue or this community? What do you need to start using this data to make change in your own portfolios and kind of with your own engagements with public companies? And investors are notoriously quiet, so I'm going to give them a little bit.
While the investors are being notoriously quiet, I just want to say, because I skipped over this insight a little bit in my comments about what we learned, that I think that investors are going to play a particularly key role on this particular issue. One really insidious thing about forced arbitration in general, not just for sexual harassment, but for discrimination and a range of issues, is that it silences large groups of people, right? So the kinds of storytelling that tend to lead a large general public audience into these issues are generally not available to us with forced arbitration, right? Because all of the people who are experiencing this are silenced. And the three cases that we heard of during this campaign all included elements of intersectional discrimination. One case, there was clear ageism going on in addition to the gender-based discrimination. In one case, there was clear racism going on. In one case, there was ableism going on. So again, to emphasize what Rachel said earlier about the intersectionality of this, these are complex cases and they involve complex legal agreements. And so the consumer audience needs to be led into this, I think, by the investor audience, and investors can play a very, very impactful role in doing that.
Wonderful. There was also a question about how do we ask our employer / HR if they have forced arbitration? And this is something that sounds like it's kind of coming from more the consumer end of things.
I love that question.
Yeah. Do you want
just ask
to...
them the question? I honestly don't think there's really any need to editorialize when you go to them to ask. It's the asking of the question that really is the putting them on notice piece that Iris talked about. In a lot of cases with these questions that I asked companies, I was going to their head of IR typically, but HR is a great place to start as well. And I could see in the background from this open rate and click-through data that I had that companies were passing the emails around pretty widely internally. In some cases, people had looked at a single individual email hundreds of times. So just don't underestimate the power of asking the question. I think, do you use forced arbitration is the perfect place to start. The answers can get kind of dense and complex, and they can try to sort of avoid the, really answering in some cases. But even if you never hear back, you will have made an impact by asking.
Yeah. Sorry about that noise. In the last few minutes, there's a couple of things I would like to cover, and particularly ask Iris to speak to. And you may not have this answer right now, but there's a very interesting question about whether we see any correlation between women in leadership at companies and whether or not they reject forced arbitration. This is kind of a question about the Ledbetter force the issue overlap and what you might be noticing there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. We haven't studied that question specifically, but I guess just being my thoughts on that are there might not necessarily be one. Most companies still require forced arbitration for sexual harassment. And as you saw in the Cody example, just because you sell women's products doesn't mean you have women in your leadership. And I think just because you have women in your leadership doesn't mean you have gender equity friendly policies. So I think there's a long ways to go in terms of turning the tide on that. But definitely proud and excited to be in this group of folks and doing this work to try to do that.
Great. And in our last few minutes, I want to actually show you all the database. I just realized that's one thing we didn't actually do. All right. Are you looking at Venice now? Let's see. Yes. Okay. Now are you looking at the database? No, you're still looking at Venice. Okay. How about that? Great. Okay. Yeah, I will get this one day. So you are an investor. Once you're looking here at the database, you can go to any particular company and you can click on it. So the information's right up front. I actually had a few people ask me, like, I can't find like the list. And I'm like, actually, no, it is right there up front. As soon as you log into the website, you can look and look up any particular company interaction. Which is one, Shannon, that I should click on that has more info?
I would say click on Dell. You have to expand the list to get to the D's, but click on Dell and it'll show kind of a track record of our communications. You can also search at the top.
Right. I know my computer is.
We have a lot of companies now.
Oh my God. Yeah, you're like, whoa. Thank you everyone for bearing with me. Right. So we actually, in addition to having the data in its more raw form, you can specifically drill down, as Shannon was mentioning to us. Yeah, and you can see the ongoing interactions. So this can actually really be a wonderful tool if you're having strategic engagements.
That little section at the bottom is worth mentioning too. If you scroll up, the latest changes section will always show you which are the companies that recently flipped.
Yep, absolutely. You can sign up for ongoing updates here. Usually it's the press that cares a lot about that, but sometimes investors do too. And this is where, oh, yay, we have like our employees impacted at 391 companies. Isn't that lovely? So it just keeps increasing. This is where you can go to get the data too. If you want your lovely GICS codes that let you dig deeper into certain industries, or ISINs that tell you about trading. And this is where you get more information, including our explainer video about what forced arbitration is and our methodology. Okay, I just figured we had to at least show you the website. Okay, we're going to, unless anyone has any outstanding questions, we are going to wrap up. Let's see, one outstanding question came in. Are you using the shareholder proposal? Oops. Are you using the shareholder proposal process to advance this issue? It's worked well on other issues, but it's technically a tricky process that may not always be effective. And Renee started to answer it, but Renee, would you like to answer that?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm
Renee's on our team.
Yeah, I work here. We partner with social justice partners to come up with these types of lists and strategies. So within our own portfolios, we actually use a strict divestment criteria and then use investor letters with our partners to leverage that issue kind of across the board rather than company specific. So we don't actually hold the companies and can't use shareholder advocacy because we don't own the shares. However, we work with, Shelley's here. We work with other partners in the industry and absolutely support, and we'll get on phone calls and do what we can to support the shareholder proxies and advocacy that's happening at other firms. We're part of a bunch of investor coalitions, and so we're all friendly. It's a tight-knit community. So we work with them and support their efforts, but within our own portfolios, we actually can't do it because we divest.
And we see our larger, at Adasina, we see our larger mission as lifting up the voices, the needs, the perspective of those who are most impacted, and basically ensuring that shareholders in forums like this know what the issues are that should be focused on and how to work on those. And I want to give a big shout out to Kristen Hull, who's here from NIA Impact Capital, whose firm has also been doing a deep amount of shareholder activism around this particular issue and has seen some changes. So.
Yeah, there's some other firms we can shout. Shelley here from RIA, and North Star's great, Zevon's great. Yep. There's some great companies.
There's a lot
that we work with.
Yeah, that is true. Thank you all for being with us. We're at the top of the hour. We're going to send out this recording just as soon as we can get it through our compliance department, as well as the presentation and other resources that we are going to gather from you as you send them to us along the way, so that we can all move forward together as investors with ending forced arbitration. Have a great rest of your day.